You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
We're back on Access Minnesota with University of Minnesota political science professor Kathryn Pearson. Kathryn, we're talking now about the 2010 midterm elections. If we look at the Republicans as they approach the elections, we see there are issues in that party that are very profound. There's still a part of the party that is considered to be extremely to the right, the so-called religious right. Do you think the party will understand that the key to success may be to moderate going into 2010 if it really does intend to try and win back a lot of the seats that it's lost over the last couple of elections?
Well, I think you have to look at the 2010 election cycle both from a micro and a macro level. And so it depends on the district in which some of these candidates are running. Now, Democrats today in the House of Representatives and Senate represent more districts and states where John McCain actually won the vote than do Republicans who represent Obama states and districts. So going into the elections, Republicans have a natural edge in some of these districts as challengers, but if they run too far to the right, it'll be problematic for them to try to defeat some of these Democratic incumbents.
Do you think there's much of a prospect for any third parties coming up in the midterm elections? We know there's a great deal of dissatisfaction among moderate voters with both those on the right and the left. Is there a way to come to the center? Are we going to see any third party candidates that may be viable?
I think it's highly unlikely. Minnesota's Senate race in 2008 actually was somewhat of an anomaly, with Dean Barkley presenting an alternative to two candidates who ran very negative campaigns, of course, Norm Coleman and Al Franken. And we don't see that many Independence Party candidates or third-party candidates in House and Senate elections, really only a handful in each cycle, and 2 independents serve in the Senate now, and none do in the House of Representatives. So I think that's unlikely. What I think might be likely is that Congress continues to enjoy a very low public approval rating.
When the Republican Party looks at the upcoming 2010 elections, what kind of strategy do you think they'll use to try and win back some of their seats?
I think particularly in these districts where John McCain actually won in 2008, I think they will very carefully and consistently tie Democratic incumbents to President Obama to try to paint them as very liberal and out of step with the district. And I think in many cases it will likely be successful. That's certainly what we witnessed in 1994 when many Republicans ran by attaching Democrats in conservative districts to an unpopular President Clinton.
To what extent did the youth vote play a major role in getting President Obama elected? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, what are the prospects for getting that youth vote back to the Democrats in the 2010 midterms?
The youth vote was a significant share of Obama's constituency, but despite all of the talk about the youth vote, it actually only increased in the share of the electorate by about 1%. So again, it's a significant part of his coalition because it went so overwhelmingly for President Obama, but it didn't increase that much relative to the 2004 elections. For Democrats to hang on to some of these congressional seats, does the entire Obama coalition in those districts need to turn out? Absolutely, yes. The youth vote being one part of that, but also Hispanic voters, African-American voters as well.
If we look at the House races in Minnesota, certainly a lot of attention is going to be focused on the 6th district, Michelle Bachmann being the incumbent there. Is this going to be a major battleground that will funnel a lot of money from both parties?
Absolutely. There's just no doubt about this. Early on in this Congress, the National Republican Congressional Committee said that this is one of their priorities in terms of seats to defend, and it seems very likely that the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee will counter with a lot of resources as well, since they view it as a seat that is possibly winnable from Republican hands. And it's interesting because this, of course, is a district where John McCain won with about 54% of the vote. But the issue here is that Congresswoman Bachmann often positions herself to the extreme of the Republican Party, saying things that are quite controversial and likely to get her on national news rather than sort of attending to her district specifically.
Is that a dangerous strategy on her part?
It's absolutely a dangerous strategy. What it meant in 2008 is that she won with less than 50% of the vote because, of course, a third-party candidate received about 10% of the vote. And so it's a dangerous strategy, and I think that's already evident in the sense that she's attracted some very strong challengers. State Senator Terrell Clark has already raised a lot of money. Physician Maureen Reed is in the race, has raised a lot of money as well. So because people sense that she's vulnerable, you know, these strong challengers have emerged, and one will face her in the general election. In
the remaining 7 districts, are there any seats that are in jeopardy at this point, do you think?
Well, these are for the most part very strong incumbents. Again, for the most part, people who've been in office for a long time. Committee chairs such as Kathryn Pearson, Jim Overstar, and then Appropriations Committee member Betsy McCollum, who represents St. Paul and is quite in tune with her district. Keith Ellison hasn't been there as long, but again, quite in tune with the ideological and partisan leanings of his district. The 3rd district is a little bit more of an open question. It's a district where President Obama won narrowly, yet Republican Eric Paulson won in an open seat. So he could be vulnerable depending on who he faces in the general election.
Let's talk about the Democratic Party's strategy in the upcoming 2010 elections. What direction do you think that party will take?
In the 2010 elections, I think it will be very much an individualized strategy for each member running for re-election. Those who are running in districts where John McCain won in 2008, they'll do their best to stress their independence, really talk about the votes in which that they cast that didn't agree with the president's position. In the Senate, it's a very interesting situation in that both parties have about an equal number of seats to defend, and so the Senate, I think, will be very, very close, and the margins in all likelihood won't switch that much.
If we look at the results of the 2008 elections and the 2006 midterm elections, the Democratic Party fared very, very well in both elections. However, there seems to be some indications now that the party may be faltering a bit. Do you think the Democrats might have misjudged the voters' intent in 2006 and 2008? By that I mean, if we take a look at the reasons why the Democrats won so handily, was it more an issue that there was great dissatisfaction with the Bush administration and Republicans in general? Or did it mean there was a switch to the left in this country? And did perhaps the Democrats not quite understand which it was?
That's a great question. Well, in 2006, exit polls clearly revealed that a lot of voters who perhaps voted for Democrats after not having done so in previous elections did so on the basis of dissatisfaction with the president, and in particular, the way in which he was handling the Iraq War. And Democrats in the majority, but yet still with President Bush, really had a hard time of changing war policy because, of course, ultimately the president is commander-in-chief and Congress only has the power of the purse, but didn't want to, be seen as cutting funds from the troops. Now that Democrats have unified party control of Congress and the White House, they are in charge of an agenda. And as you note, they got into power on the basis of an unpopular president and a Congress who was seen as not very effective. So now they face the challenge of actually governing rather than just presenting an alternative. And I think, as they have found, governing is quite a challenge, but assuming healthcare is successful, and if the Senate can pass an energy bill and reconcile it with the bill that the House has passed, along with some financial services legislation, it is quite possible that Democrats will be campaigning on a fairly substantial legislative agenda going into 2010. But because of the 60-vote requirement in the Senate, I think it will be more moderate than many of the House Democrats would like.
Kathryn Pearson, political science professor at the University of Minnesota, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The struggle to desegregate our nation's schools began in the 1950s, but some critics say Minnesota's public schools are more segregated today than they were in the late 1960s. Coming up next on Access Minnesota, a look at the Brown Power Initiative and why its supporters think it may be the key to bringing greater diversity to our schools.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.